The discourse starts right now with Cheryl Oates and Erika Barudis.
Well, folks, we are back. Now that Cheryl has returned from her wine and tapas tour in Spain, we can get back to our regular programming. Cheryl may feel this is over the top. I think it's completely appropriate that I'm going to catch you up, Cheryl, on Alberta, which it continues, not shockingly to anyone, to charge ahead with their plan to get a pipeline to Tidewater, while Ottawa and BC play their super fun game of how can we make this harder, or as others may know it as, how to hurt our economy further. But don't worry, that's not all that you missed, Cheryl. We'll dive into the latest on the teachers' strike as parents across the province remember why they didn't choose to homeschool, and wrap it all up with this thrilling world of license plates that Alberta just rolled out. So with that, welcome home, Oates.
Thank you. And I appreciate that completely borderline belligerent intro to the list of current events. Happy to go through it piece by piece rather than interrupt your string of lies to launch this podcast. But I was gone for a week. That's why we didn't do a podcast last week. I was on kind of like a Premier Notley's office reunion tour as one of her former chiefs of staff got married in Spain. So that was a fun little trip. Obviously, we talked about Alberta politics the entire time. And not to mention, Erika and I, if you want to catch up on it, we're on Hotel Pacifico this week. Our friends who do a very similar podcast in British Columbia talking about BC events. We did a crossover episode with them talking about pipelines that just launched this week. So check that one out as well. But maybe that's a good place to start. I mean, the only person who's worked for a political party who has actually overseen the successful construction of a pipeline to Tidewater is me. Just worth starting there. But I think, let's start there and talk about what Danielle Smith is up to. You said your piece off the top, David Eby.
So now it's your web of lies.
Yeah. Can I spin a couple things quick? I think this is an interesting project. And a lot of people have been comparing the project to TMX to say we got TMX done. We learned some things that way. Let's just do it all over again. I think there's some really big differences that are worth pointing out between TMX and this current, I don't even know if we can call it a proposal, this current idea Danielle Smith has of building a pipeline to the north coast of British Columbia. First, and you've probably heard this if you've been following this debate at all, there is no proponent for this project. And I think that it should be the biggest red flag, that there is no company, despite Danielle Smith's efforts, despite her government's now promise to basically escort this project to fruition, no private company has come forward saying they want to build this pipeline. Do you want to stop there before I go through my...
Sure. I was like, well, and I have two thoughts on that. First off, I mean, how are we going to start advocating and saying that it's an option without someone leading it? So I don't think that that's necessarily the forever case. I believe that the government is working, and hopefully the federal government, on bringing in a private company to back it. I mean, TMX had a private company, and thanks to Trudeau left because it was costing them so much money. The government needed to take it over. So that's another difference between TMX and this project. And I think it's a fair point to point out currently, but that doesn't mean that there isn't interest. I think that what we also face, and why I think Danielle Smith needed to come out and push for this project and talk about all the other things, is because of the policies that have also got in the way of businesses seeing Canada as a great place to do business and invest, right? We've seen investor confidence leave, especially in the energy sector under Trudeau. And I think it's now up to Carney to live out his commitment of the this economic superpower that we're looking to have, or that he campaigned on, frankly.
To make those points, and I agree, yes, we want international investment. At this point, we need to have some resource development. But I don't think this project, and whether this project goes ahead or not, is the deciding factor of whether Canada can do projects like this, because there are multiple projects going on right now in British Columbia that prove all of those things, that Canada can do big things, that Canada can export its resources. It doesn't all hinge on this project. Danielle Smith is basically saying, in addition to all those projects, I think we also need this pipeline. And I think that's the part that is kind of up for debate, is do we need this pipeline? Because we have the Trans Mountain expansion, which will not be at capacity now until I think 2028. at which point there are ways to even increase capacity beyond that, including dredging the Burrard Inlet and adding diluent to the pipeline to add more product to it. So the question is part of the reason we don't see private proponents stepping up for this pipeline is that there just really isn't a business case here for what Danielle Smith is proposing.
And perhaps this early on, I think that's a fair question. I wouldn't be surprised if there is appetite or folks currently looking at the feasibility of the project. I think the biggest challenge right now is what Carney's going to do about it. I think it was a political play by the Alberta government and Danielle Smith to kind of call Carney out on what he's doing. And I know we'll probably get into some of the semantics of TMX and that the argument it's not currently operating at capacity. There's reasons why that's the case, including initial investment of pumping or ability to pump and the pressure. So that's a whole nother issue of getting it up to actual capacity. But I guess it's like, what is the downfall of a government saying we have, a product that we want to get to market? This isn't the only one she's exploring. She's like, let's get it to any port.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're even exploring of getting back into bed with Trump on a Keystone pipeline, which I think we'll probably get to too.
Yeah. The interesting piece in all of this obviously is what's at stake for this pipeline. Like, I think the difference between TMX and this particular project is what David Eby, the Premier of British Columbia, is saying is at stake should Danielle Smith continue to push ahead with a heavy oil pipeline to a coast that is currently under a tanker ban. And what the Premier is saying is that there's a whole bunch of projects in the north where they have built really fragile consensus with First Nations and communities about moving ahead with LNG and exporting LNG. And if a heavy oil project is forced through here, or if the tanker ban is lifted, all of that consensus is in jeopardy. So we're not necessarily talking about adding an economic project to a whole bunch of existing economic projects. We might actually be talking about trading off all of those existing projects with real private sector proponents for Danielle Smith's idea of a pipeline to the coast.
So do we want to play, before we dive into it a little bit more, Eby and Smith's kind of, because they're coming at it from two different sides of the argument, which I think is for purpose too. Maybe let's play their clips just so we can see what their both of their narratives are.
The fictional Alberta bitumen pipeline project achieves literally none of these things. Doesn't have First Nations consent. Makes no financial or economic sense. It has no private proponent, no route, no private funding, and would cost taxpayers billions. The non-existent Alberta pipeline project would put tens of billions of dollars in real BC projects and jobs at risk. On top of that, it threatens one of the world's most precious and intact ecosystems, our beautiful BC coast and Great Bear Rainforest. What the Conservatives in Alberta are pushing is an entirely political creation in the lead up to their election for wedge politics at the expense of British Columbia and Canada's.
Well, I think Premier Eby's comments are un-Canadian and they're unconstitutional. I think that the Supreme Court has determined that the reason we have a country and have given trade and commerce power and control over ports and interprovincial infrastructure to the federal government is for exactly this reason, so that a parochial premier isn't able to block nation-building projects. So I think that the courts have been pretty clear on that. And I would hope that Prime Minister Mark Carney would realize it's his obligation to make sure that these kinds of projects get built. When you look at the value of bitumen, we believe that this project, if we could build it at 1 million barrels a day, even at today's prices, that would generate $20 billion a year for the Canadian economy, of which the governments take about 40%, and it's about half that goes to the federal government and half that goes to the provincial government. So that is a very high value, long-term return that all it takes is the Prime Minister to say yes. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get to that by mid-November.
So Danielle Smith is calling Premier Eby's comments un-Canadian. That is her sort of like sound bite of that clip, is saying he's un-Canadian. These are projects that are good for all of Canada, and we need to all work together to get big projects done. And Premier Eby is saying, what's Canadian is working together in the interest of all provinces, and this is not in the interest of BC, and it also jeopardizes a whole bunch of other things. So, I mean, we talked about this a little bit on Hotel Pacifico, like whose narrative, whose argument is better? And truthfully, as we saw through the Trans Mountain debate, both premiers' arguments will serve their domestic audiences perfectly. It's what BC wants to hear from their premier. It's what Alberta wants to hear from their premier.
So I agree that I think that both maybe as premier, but also ideologically to some degree, and I'll criticize EB on that. I think he's like being a little bit too ideological in his position. And the reason I say that is actually because of an Angus Reid poll that came out that actually has a lot of Canadians. So Premier Smith's point, it's un-Canadian. Maybe that's a little bit forceful, but that it's un-Canadian because Canadians want this. The second part is that 56% of BC residents want this pipeline or a pipeline to go ahead. And so I think that when we talk about the narrative, absolutely from a political standpoint, I think EB's talking to his audience. I think Premier Smith is successfully, from a narrative standpoint, like they're both doing their job as a political figure in a very contentious jurisdictional fight. So I do agree, but I think it's harder for Eby in this case because I'm pretty sure even, you being on the other aisle, besides Nenshi coming out against pipelines, but I think a lot of NDP supporters or people that have voted NDP in Alberta would actually back Premier Smith on this. So I do think that Eby's walking a finer line with 56% of his population maybe not agreeing with him.
So I agree and I disagree. Like, I think those numbers, that's a big number, especially for British Columbia, of saying that they wanted to see a pipeline. If history tells us anything, it's that 56% is a very specific population geographically of British Columbia. And so, yes, it's less likely that geographic population are where the NDP supporters are. So yes, Premier Eby
or where the project is on coast.
Yeah. So Premier Eby is in part speaking to his supporters, but it has the benefit of being true. Like the stuff that he's talking about is not just ideological. There are projects at stake, and that's not an ideological stance. That's an economic stance. That's a business stance to say BC as a province cannot stand to lose all of this investment and all of this activity and all of these projects for the sake of a project that isn't real at this point. And then on top of that, I think another really interesting piece of that Angus Reid poll is, yes, I think many people are surprised to see 56% of British Columbians in support of an oil pipeline to Tidewater. But in the same poll, we see that a big portion, I'm trying to pull up the number here, 52% of British Columbians also believe that their province should have veto over projects until conditions are met. So there's so much nuance here. Like, yes, of course, when you ask people, like, do you want a pipeline? There's a lot of people that will say yes. Do you want a pipeline with no conditions? Do you want Alberta to just be able to push ahead? A lot of British Columbians are going to say no.
They want don't understand the Constitution, apparently.
Or don't understand. I think, too, we talked about this before when Premier Smith sets out to push ahead major projects like this, is that she hasn't really learned any lessons from all the reasons this failed or was difficult to do a decade ago. And when you look at what's worked in British Columbia is like going out and finding ways to get to yes with the communities who are most likely to oppose. She didn't do that. Like, she stood up on a stage and said, Alberta's going to do this whether you like it or not. And that is a recipe for disaster.
I don't know if it's a recipe for disaster. I think it is definitely a very aggressive political move, and that's to set the stage for the conversation she wants to have. The reality is that the federal government can make this happen if they want to make this happen, right? Within their constitutional rights, they can basically have that power over provincial jurisdiction, right? So I think the difficult part, and that's a different political play, which I don't think that the Carney government is just going to come out and say, move over BC. But we have talked a lot about this Canadian economy, and if Canada can own Alberta's resources and benefit economically, why can't Canada benefit from coastal access under BC? So again, I think it comes down to semantics and maybe people not understanding what the jurisdictional responsibilities or power of the federal government. They could come through and say it. Coming back to your point, though, on the consultations, I just want to ask, do you think if a proponent, so a private company, was standing at that announcement with Danielle Smith when she talked about this Northern Pipeline, do you think Eby's response would be the same, or do you think it'd be different?
I think he would probably still oppose because of all of the same reasons. I think it would change a little bit because right now we're talking about risking real projects for a project that doesn't have a proponent. Obviously, that changes if we're talking about two sets of real projects. Like, that's a real discussion to be had. But like, at this point, it's pretty easy for him to say, why would we risk all of these real tangible projects that are close to final investment decisions for something that doesn't have a proponent. So that would change.
And so I guess my question is like, do you think BC people that maybe took the Angus report or the general public even understands that? And or do you think that that's actually the case? Like I look at the risk assessment and it's like, I don't know if I buy that we force this pipeline and all these other projects. So our balance sheet looks like X at the end of the day. I think it's a risk, but I don't know if I agree with well, they're all going to walk away if we force this through.
But it's not David Eby saying that. It's the First Nation saying that. And like when you assess risk, that's all you can assess, right? Like you have these First Nations that say we have backed projects, we have equity in projects, but all of this hinges on a tanker ban staying in place. And you have chiefs coming out saying if a tanker ban is lifted, all of this is in jeopardy. And I think that's a really real risk. You have to take that seriously.
And again, I'm trying to understand his position. Now, there's a lot of Indigenous people and groups along that pathway that are super supportive. I also wanted to ask you, because when we were on Hotel Pacifico, we kind of talked about what I think would actually be a possible great solution for BC should they want to entertain this. I know they've discussed it, but haven't put it into place. You even said on this podcast that the greatest thing that the UCP has done when we were trying to be like nice to our other sides was the AIOC, which is the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corp, which gives Indigenous groups, especially along pathways of projects, real skin in the game, for lack of a better term, meaning that they get a financial benefit. They're invested both from the entire project, but also from in formulas that would financially be sustainable over time as the project goes. So it's not just a pass through, here's a fee, here's some jobs. It's a long-term investment in the projects in which they helped build. Do you think that BC is even ready to look at that to try and be part of Team Canada here? Like, I think if they brought that forward, which Eby's talked about but hasn't put into fruition, that could also maybe diminish some of this risk that he's talking about. Like, I don't see that the Indigenous groups are getting the same benefit of being part of a project, which I would be pissed off too. Coming through my backyard.
I don't think that's really fair. Like, yes, Alberta's AIOC is great. It's cool. It's very precedent setting. It has opened a lot of doors for a lot of nations that might not have been able to participate otherwise. But BC doesn't have a problem with First Nations taking equity stakes in major projects. Like, BC is leading the way in terms of First Nations being the major equity holder in LNG projects. And so, like, yes, could there always be a room for the government to create more capacity and more opportunity for First Nations to participate? Absolutely. But it's not like that's not happening in British Columbia or that British Columbia hasn't made a precedent and actually said its criteria for resource development projects to move forward is that First Nations have an equity stake. So yes, Alberta's program is very cool. Other jurisdictions can certainly learn lessons from it, but it's not that BC hasn't really been a leader on First Nations equity otherwise.
Okay, so I want to ask you before we move on in a couple minutes, so coming back to the Carney thing, I think I understand why Eby is doing what Eby's doing. I understand why Smith's doing what Smith's doing. Both of them are trying to tie it back to the greater Team Canada and respect their Indigenous groups, respecting our energy sector and our opportunity for revenue. All of these things. The big player, and I actually, when we were on Hotel Pacifico, said like the person I don't think is winning the narrative right now is Prime Minister Carney. Do you think, maybe a loaded question, but do you think in that next tranche of projects that are supposed to come out before Grey Cup, which is so Canadian of us to put a timeline around Grey Cup, but do you think that any of Smith's projects or discussions are on that? Do you think that there's an appeasement there? And do you think that he's going to intervene? I mean, his minister kind of dodged the question about this project or even the federal government's actual constitutional role in projects like this. So how do you think the feds play this?
Honestly, I know that Mark Carney is getting some criticism for not taking a position on this. I think he's doing exactly the right thing. And in fact, I think he's doing what Premier Smith has done with so many contentious issues in Alberta, which is not take a position. We saw during the separatist debate at its height, Premier Smith walked the line of saying, I really think we should stay in Canada, but if you want to put a referendum question to the entire public on whether we should separate, I will make that far easier for you. So basically, she got to take both sides at the same time and let this play out until she is absolutely forced to take a position. And Mark Carney is doing the same thing. He's saying, you want us to look at a pipeline? You bring us a pipeline to look at. We're not going to say no until we have to say no. And I think that is the right thing for him to do here.
And do you think he's just never going to say no? Like if, let's say the scenario where a proponent comes to the table, it's a feasible project. They've done some, consultation, which is consultation with First Nations by our agreements. Do you think do you think he says no? Or do you think we're going to get a pipeline under Carney?
It's so hard to say. It's so hard to imagine that there would even be a point where he has to say no. Like, there's nothing to say no to right now. Danielle Smith wants to push a pipeline ahead, hoping she gets a proponent. Go ahead, Danielle Smith. To the point where we actually have a proponent, a proposal, a decision point is so far off for the federal government. Like, they could even put this on their projects list. They can put it on their secondary list as something that needs a little bit more work because it needs a lot more work. So I think the point where Mark Carney has to actually say no to this, which would obviously be an inflection point for Danielle Smith, it's just not close right now.
Yeah, I do want to bring up Keystone, but I do want to come back to, because the budget is coming federally in a couple weeks here. One of the things that you've talked about is TMX and that it's not at capacity right now. That's an argument by Eby.
And TMX
I'd
is
say
saying
that
it's an argument. TMX is
no,
saying
no,
that.
sorry. They're saying it's not at capacity. I want to give context though for the reason is it's actually not because we don't have product to get into it. We're seeing challenges with exactly how it's operating. So the expansion is set. I don't know what it's at right now. It's about 80%, I want to say, capacity right now. There is an ability, but what would be required is another infrastructure project and approval by the federal government's investment, because they own this pipeline, of $3 to $4 billion, which would increase production. And it's to basically put a pumping system that can shoot some of the chemicals that are heavier and create this dragging that you mentioned. We could see 5 to 10% increase on that capacity, which is, about 50,000 to 85,000 extra barrels per day. Do you think that the federal government's putting that on that list or projects that they're going to invest in?
So I think that is a more realistic idea than a pipeline with no proponent. Like what they're talking about is adding to the existing expansion to create more capacity on top of the capacity that the expansion created. And I think that makes more sense given the infrastructure is already in place than a new pipeline proposal. So yes, I think that could totally be on the list. And I also think that because Trans Mountain is existing, you're not going to see opposition from the BC government on it, which makes all of this a lot easier.
I'm more merrier, so I'll take all the pipelines going east, west, but maybe that's where Premier Eby draws the line. What do you think happens if it's not on there? Like, I'm sitting here and I'm like, well, that's $3 to $4 billion in this multi-$100 billion deficit that they're running. What's $3 to $4 billion to expand this and expand
but who
our
knows,
revenue?
right? Like, okay, we'll get to Keystone in 1 second. I have one more question about because I wanted to add Keystone in there. I have one more question about Danielle Smith's proposal.
Okay.
Does she even like truthfully, the benefit for Danielle Smith politically in this battle is for it to go on forever. Danielle Smith never needs to get to yes. She never needs to get to no. Political points for Danielle Smith are her fighting day in and day out against Ottawa and against British Columbia and against anyone who wants to take on Alberta's main economic driver, is to fight every day for progress there. And yes, getting to yes is a nice flag to wave if you get there. But really, the benefit for Danielle Smith in the lead up to the next Alberta election is that she's fighting. And so I think that's where the political benefit for her is here, not winning the fight.
Well, I think it's a win for Danielle Smith if she gets a pipeline in her term. It shuts down the NDP's comment that we're the only ones that got a pipeline approved, right? So I think politically, she would be very happy, and as a premier and as a province, we would be very happy with a pipeline. I think she's looking at every option right now. I think this was actually more of a political play, not on the long term that I think you're talking about, but Carney and her have had all these niceties and all these great conversations and more to come. We're working hard to reach an agreement, blah, blah, blah. And I don't know if this is her putting pressure on Carney because like we said, ultimately Carney can make or break this deal today, tomorrow, or find other solutions. It might be, let's look at this project, and then he invests in TMX. He looks at 1, 2 through Manitoba, right? I think it's a pressure point to say, you're saying all now really nice things. The stuff you campaigned on doesn't hurt Alberta, but let's see some proof. And I think that was her announcing that okay, we need to hear from you, Ottawa, and you need to recognize that we criticize you for being in our house. on your constitutional rights, go use that to your benefit and get a pipeline to Tidewater.
So,
And I think even Keystone, she would deem a success.
so let me just put this a little bit more sharp. I don't think that this project was ever set up, like her proposal was ever set up to be successful. The things she's asking for are completely unrealistic. Like she's saying that this is going to be like a grand bargain, but there's no real bargain. Like she's basically saying drop 9 bad laws, get rid of carbon pricing, get rid of the emissions cap, and give me a pipeline by the Grey Cup. And that's just like and she hasn't done any work to socialize this with Northern BC communities. Like there's no real path to get to yes, even if the federal government says yes. So I think the entire thing was set up, not intentionally, but is set up to be unsuccessful. And I just don't know if that matters.
I would assume that the government would go through and they'd be looking at, maybe some of the criticism you made about like socializing this, having those conversations. Like Danielle Smith comes out with, as we've seen with all of her meetings with Carney, it's like, here's what my plan is.
Mm-hmm.
And here is my demands and all of these things. I think this was very similar to how she's communicated that with the prime minister. I think she's saying, this is my intention to explore this, look at the feasibility, try and get a proponent that would be interested in making this a reality. So I do think she's looking at this pipeline project as a true reality. Now, let's be honest, this isn't coming to full fruition or even being constructed during potentially even her tenure if she has a second term. This is a long-term project. I think what she's looking for is also the double edge of this sword is, maybe that's not the right expression, but like making Carney actually make a move, to see where he is really balancing up on what he's going to use his federal powers to do, and if he's really serious about creating a pipeline. Now, full 180, now they're all like, look at Keystone might be here. Did we not just talk for 6 months, an entire campaign about elbows up against the or against the president of the United States? And now we're like, you know what? Just kidding.
But
Let's
okay,
have a pipeline
that's
with
how
you.
that's when I heard about it, that's how I was like, okay, we're talking about energy security, we're talking about economic security. Isn't this the opposite of that? But when you're thinking about it as a bargaining chip to a better trade deal, I think it makes a lot of sense. Like if we have so little to leverage, we have so very little to leverage in Canada,
Which is sad. Like,
but it's
really sad for
this
us.
position that we've
It's
put
true.
ourselves in by
Yeah,
being reliant on the US for so long. We have so very little to leverage. If we can leverage something that also benefits Alberta's economy, Canada's economy, our industry, like let's not just do things because let's not do things because they feel like the wrong thing to do and because we don't like America right now. Like, let's think about whether this is in Canada's long-term interest, even if it doesn't reach our goals of economic independence or energy independence or energy security.
And listen, I'm pro pipeline any which way, north, south, east, west. So like, I don't care that we're exploring this. I mean, I do care because I think to all your points, I think it's beneficial. I just find it so frickin' ironic that
If
our
that's where we
prime
land?
minister, yes, like it's like, oh, we're actually not going to build any pipelines here. And again, if TMX doesn't get this expansion approval or the injection of funds to be able to produce those plus $50,000 or 50,000 barrels a day extra, the tankers aren't at capacity. Like we can get, yes, TMX, let's like double down on that sucker. But it's just so sad for us that this is where we get to. It's like we did build a pipeline, but it was actually furthering our dependence on the United States of America.
But that might be.
I just find it not.
It's not what anybody
sad, but it's
wants.
ironic.
Canada wants to be able to stand up and say, okay, US, we don't need you anymore. We can build our own economic independence and we can find new trade allies and we can diversify. But like, truthfully, that is really difficult to do. And the end of this isn't going to look like the perfect outcome for Canada. And so it's like, you got to give and take. And unfortunately, you might have to do some things that you originally didn't want to do. For all the lack of bargaining chips, Keystone feels like a really big one.
And Keystone can happen, but then it's like, but don't stop. Don't just check a box. We got a pipeline. Under me, we got a pipeline. Like, I think that what Alberta will continue pushing for, and it's in Danielle Smith's political interest and against Mark Carney's political interest, to say, okay, but what about this project? What about this project? What about this? And we're then getting to partners that are overseas through the Pacific and the Atlantic that we are also growing towards, even though we've got this Keystone that we're in bed with them on. We're also exploring our economic. Yeah. And I think that's where, again, Mark Carney's given Danielle a re-election campaign over and over again because he's allowing, not stepping up, I think, right now on what that looks like. Like, what's the master plan here? But
I guess we'll see.
Be well, but at Grey Cup. So if you are waiting for the halftime show at Grey Cup, it'll be
It'll be
Danielle
Danielle
Smith,
Smith.
and Danielle Smith with Mark Carney carrying like a pipeline onto the field. It'd be great.
Okay. Wow. You really kept that one going.
I did. Yeah. I envisioned it. Okay, teachers strike. All right. So we're going to pivot a little bit. In case you didn't know, if you're a parent in Alberta, your kids are still at home. But in a benefit to maybe that, after last week was kind of crickets between the government and the ATA. As of Tuesday this week, the government and the ATA went back to the bargaining table. I will say, because I've obviously been watching this closely, I think as most people have, I still haven't, besides that initial Jason Schilling coming out and being like, okay, we see your 3,000 teachers and we raise you 5,000. I haven't really even seen clarity to my question 2 weeks ago, which was, what does the ATA want and what are they expecting? So, 5,000 teachers sounds fabulous, but how do we just make those classrooms appear immediately? And how do these graduates appear out of thin air? So again, maybe you have some inklings of, as you sat around sipping wine, talking about how we solve this teacher strike. Maybe there's some insights you have to how the ATA is positioning this that I'm missing.
Yeah, I think so. First of all, I don't think we need like I know in the medical profession when we say we need more doctors, we need more doctors, we need more doctors, and where are the doctors going to come from? There are actually teachers, trained teachers in Alberta sitting on sub lists and trying to get jobs in schools that can't get them. So I do think it's not for lack of having teachers, it's that the province hasn't been hiring teachers. Do we need to keep pushing out graduates? Absolutely. But there are teachers, lots of teachers waiting to be hired into Alberta schools. When it comes to what the ATA is asking for, I agree that I don't think that their communications has always been crystal clear. But at this point, they've done a little better. They've been asking for, as a province that has been blessed with natural resources revenues and at times has run multi-billion-dollar surpluses to properly fund education. They would like to say, we're rich. We have been rich. Even if we're running a deficit right now, we have been in a great position to properly fund our public services, and the province should have, over the last 10 years, they funded education. And of course, yes, teachers say they want to be paid fairly for the work that they're doing at a salary that continues to attract thousands of new teachers, because if you are a Canadian teacher working in another jurisdiction right now, how the UCP views education, that is going to be, I think, really tough to recruit to.
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll get you to talk about it, but Peter MacKay, who was but was the lead negotiator, who's no longer there. Not sure why, but I'd love to know that hot goss. But he did an interview on Wednesday, and he actually shared, because he was asked, essentially, where's the disconnect? What can we expect to go forward? How is this going to look for parents? What's this new negotiation coming back to the table going to look like? And he basically just came out and said, at this point, given that almost 90%, so he's talking about the last vote that happened in September, of what we're really looking for and what is necessary is the government's going to have to step up with something. We heard an awful lot from teachers and what they voted on last spring in September. And those two things weren't really far apart, meaning the vote in June and the vote in September. What the government's committed to, he's saying, there's not much difference between the two. And that's probably what I think he's alluding to, being a similar percentage of lack of support for this deal. They felt that the government needed to step up and make a greater investment into education. It's not so much the bargainers at the table. It's the folks behind the bargainers on the government side who need to step up and do what's necessary in order to get a deal and get everyone back to work. And then he went on to say the big issues that are remaining. So I think it was what can we expect from this? So he says the big issues that are remaining, as I understand it, are additional hiring, perhaps pupil-teacher ratios, class size caps, or to change the working conditions. But the other elements is salaries, and the fact is you can't solve one without solving the other. If you're going to attract more teachers, any of those solutions to class sizes or class conditions, you're going to need more teachers. You can't attract more teachers without a more competitive salary, and right now, Alberta is not competitive. So I want to throw it over to you, because that actually confused me a little bit more of what they're looking for than maybe. Well, I do get that he's right in I think, and he said this in the interview as well, the ATA and the government are in very different positions on this. They are on opposite ends of the room. And I think everyone would like them to come a little bit together and work through that. The reason I think it's confusing is because I'm just going to go through what he lists. So, like, as I understand it, our additional hiring, the government is doing that. 1,000 teachers over 1,000 teachers a year over 3 years, which gives us 3,000 new teachers, which puts us at a ratio of 20 to 1. Now, I recognize that's at the current escalations of people coming to our province, but I still think that's a damn good ratio of 20 to 1 students. Now, I get you can complain it's not happening overnight, but that is in 3 years, we would get that down. So year over year, we're improving. So that addresses the pupil teachers. Class size caps, I don't understand the class size caps because I don't know how you then tell people when we have not enough teachers, not enough classrooms, not enough schools, that like, hey, your kid was number 36, so he's going to go learn in the field and he's not going to be able to come into school or class or maybe go find somewhere else. Like, to me, that's also like the idea of class caps when we had this 250,000 people come into our province. You can blame the government if you want for that. But either way, it's a reality. I don't know how you can even talk about class caps.
They're talking about phasing it in. They're not talking about having like class caps
But I haven't
today.
seen their total plan, right? Maybe it is that we get to a ratio of 20 to 1 and the government and them have conversations that like, and we'll never be in a space where we don't fund for 25 to 1.
Yeah.
Let's say that.
I mean,
now that's not in a bargaining. That unfortunately, that would be an agreement in good faith that the government, I'd freaking run on that if I was the UCP in the next election. But the hard thing is you can't put that into anything outside of a 3-year bargaining.
So, I mean, the government can, like, basically what teachers are asking for is a new tone set from the government. Like, some of this, is not, it doesn't come down to actual salaries or actual, like, the teachers are asking for a better work environment. And some of that will be the government taking a position and making promises that are not part of the collective agreement that assure teachers that they're going to be working in an environment where they feel like they can do their jobs. And so, it's not status quo for what you would expect from bargaining, but teachers have a ton of leverage right now. And I think that's what, like, whether you understand they're getting what they asked for, like I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, Erika, but I think from your position, you're like, teachers have asked for this stuff. The government's giving them all this stuff. Like, what's the problem now? Teachers are asking for more than that.
Or even so, like, what are you asking for? Because the next point he makes is like, or to change working conditions. I'm like, well, that's really vague. Like, what does that mean?
But I'm sure that they're having more detailed, like, they're not going to the province and saying, we would like you to change working conditions. Like, I'm sure behind closed doors in bargaining, this is where the details come out. They're having much more detailed discussions. And
Hope so.
They were talking about 5,000 versus 3,000 teachers. But whether the UCP think it's right or not, what we should be keeping the closest eye on, which is the case in any public bargaining, is how the public feels about this debate right now. Obviously, labor groups always want the public to side with them. The government always wants the public to side with them. You can say that the ATA isn't communicating well, but the polling would suggest that right now, the public is with them. Angus Reid released a poll showing across the province, people say their sympathies are more with teachers in this labor dispute, triple the number who say they are siding with the government. So the majority of people right now say they're on the teacher side, and only 21% say they're with the government. And if I was the government watching this play out, those numbers are only going to widen. I would be wanting to wrap this up really quickly. Because we talked about in Saskatchewan, those numbers eat away at your overall popularity really, really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, because I believe in facts. When you have facts and figures like that is a concern. I mean, there's also neither or not sure still equals 23%. Like, there's a lot of people, oddly, I'm actually surprised at how many people aren't interacting with this. And maybe it's because they don't have kids in the system. I do know from conversations with friends, like, it's starting to wear on parents. I don't think that there's anyone out there that doesn't sympathize for teachers in the sense of what the reality is in classrooms. Classrooms are too big. We know that. Is it a byproduct of the government directly? I don't think so in all cases. We have a growing population and we're building those schools. I think this is the worst of it, to be honest, because of the mass immigration and emigration that we've seen on how we plan. Like, 3 years ago, we were closing schools down. Now we're building a bunch to offset this, but those don't happen overnight. I think it's a finicky line, because how hard do you push, or what more would you give? Maybe the government accepts this 5,000 teachers and it becomes like 1,500 and 2,000 or whatever to equal that. but we have to make sure that there's schools there. So again, I don't know if I think the 5,000 equates to how many classrooms we would be able to put students in. I like the ratio 20-1. Just again, I'm like very confused because then the last thing he says, and you're right, like polling numbers matter. And I would be supportive if the government put more into not teachers' pockets, but into the rest of the bargaining. Then he goes on to say, though, this is where I was really confused, coming back to your original question, was like, he comes back and then says, yeah, it is about more money.
Yeah. Well, they're asking for more money. Like they're asking for more money for themselves, and they're asking for more competitive salaries to be able to attract more teachers.
Right. So I'd be interested to know the public, and I know we're not polling either of us on this, but like one, I think people are sympathetic for teachers. I don't think they're sympathetic for the ATA. And I think that there's a disjointment or an understanding. I don't know if there's a difference, but if I saw like, I mean, the ATA PR nightmare goes to Kananaskis as a retreat last week when the teachers are going on strike. Doesn't look good for them. They also didn't have any money to give their teachers for strike pay. Like, to me, I'm like, the bigger thing is like the ATA is underserving their members right now. And I hope that teachers realize through this negotiation. But to your point, the general public, I don't think knows the difference.
And when it comes to like, here's a couple more stats, because I think there's some interesting parts of this poll. I think we both agree, most Albertans, and the poll backs it up, 84% believe there are too many kids in classrooms. To your question of how the public feels about how teachers are paid, 56% disagree that teachers are paid enough as it stands. Not a massive number.
But that's not with the 12%. Like, this is the thing, is we're not polling on if they got this raise.
But the public's not following the minutia of this detail of this negotiation.
Right,
they're saying teachers are on strike because they're underpaid. That's what they know. And the government hasn't given them enough to not be striking. That's all they're going to know. They're not going to know the government offered them 12 and that's not enough for them. And now they want this. No one's following that. They're following.
No, I get that.
And that's what's at risk for the government, because what I would really be watching for the government is what I talked about in Saskatchewan, because in the poll, 28% of UCP supporters also think the government is wrong in this. And 28 might not seem like a massive number, but 89% of NDP supporters are on the side of the teachers. And so when you start to see a big portion of the government supporters as well moving to the other side of the issue, I think that's when you really have a problem. And that's the number I would be keeping the closest eye on if I was the UCP right now, is that the number of people who actually side with the government in their base is 40%. That's it. 40% of people think they're right. I was going to highlight
that 40%, which I do think like that 40% is what caught my eye more than the 28, because it's like you would hope that your base would be supportive of that. Now, I don't know what the government's doing. Yeah.
You take the undecided, like the people who say no one's right in this, 68% of people are not siding with the government in the UCP space.
Yeah, meaning you're adding the neither and the government together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
and again,
that's
like,
not good addition. There's 56% are saying they're not with them. But like, that's half your base that doesn't think you're doing the right thing or can't like fully get behind you.
Yeah. And this is the delicateness. This is probably why like the government was urging them from day one to come back to the table. ATA kind of stuck their feet, like their heels in the sand. I think the government gets the implications. Now, does it make them fold? I highly doubt it. So like I said, I don't think that 12% is going to move, because they see it as 12, possibly 17. And it kind of screws them on all the other political plays that they had with other collective bargaining. So I do think that there's room. I wouldn't be surprised if the government came out with a tone about what we're committing to going forward with either ratios or class sizes, et cetera, to try and keep that number low, not just get it to there in 3 years, but even as the nimbleness that they would invest into education to make sure that those ratios do not get slowed down based on injection of population, right? That might be a play. It might be that they agree on 4,000.
The government can agree to hold out, they can decide to hold out, right? But it's to their detriment. Like right now, the public is with them. It's likely based on those numbers that the public will continue to move with the teachers. And so they can hold out all they want, but it's only going to hurt them in the long run. And right now, if you're the ATA thinking strategically about this, you have all the leverage. You may as well keep pushing. You may as well keep pushing for everything. You may as well keep the teachers out of classrooms because the public thinks you're right. So eventually the government's going to have to cave on something.
And I suspect that, like I said, I don't think it's on salaries, but as a parent, I'd rather not it go to salaries and go to addressing some of the more holistic issues. But you're right. And nobody, especially the government, wants to have to legislate it because that is going to be a bigger issue. I agree with the government not having session return early to address this. I think this can hopefully be solved by bargaining at the bargaining table and getting to a point where the government gives more than they think they can give. Might be the case, but you're right. Every day impacts both. I think the ATA is actually, Jason Chilling was coming out real hot for a while, and I don't think maybe he was advised by someone that he's putting his foot in his mouth and really actually making it more confusing with his narrative, because I haven't seen him out as much since they actually went on strike.
Put something out yesterday. You can go to the ATA website to watch it.
What does it say?
It's just like an update on what they're up to.
But I mean, like him being pretty political and aggressive on it, I think his tone has changed. Maybe he realized.
Well, hopefully that's a sign of good bargaining happening.
Good bargaining? Yeah.
Let's move to our last shiny object to talk about today. But first, are you curious about how the government works and want to shape public policy or dream of running campaigns yourself? Applications for Macquarie College's January intake are now open. Sign up for the Applied Politics and Public Affairs Diploma, and you can get the skills you need for a public affairs or political career in under 2 years. Visit macquariecollege.com/programs and click on Applied Politics today. Very fun
Okay, so
course.
you're teaching your second class. So you're just finishing up,
motoring
right?
through, yeah. Talking about lots of fun stuff.
Which class are you teaching right now?
I am teaching communicating public policy. Yeah.
Maybe the ATA should take that class. I'm just kidding. I'm teaching election communication right now too. So students get one cohort gets me in the morning and you in the afternoon. What a great.
And then they listen
watch
to our
the
podcast at
podcast in
night.
between.
Yeah. Okay, so we are
Awesome.
cutting
Okay.
it close on time. So let's do some quick hot takes on the new, not so subtle separation license plates. But don't worry, you can have your say on which background you would like on Alberta's new license plates. But let me first just say before we just talk about this, if this doesn't scream like shiny object the government is hoping to distract the public with, I don't know what does. The government is doing this like tournament style online vote to decide what your next plate will look like. Obviously, lots of stories since the new plates say strong and free, which just by coincidence happens to be the UCP's tagline of the party. Very interesting and perhaps effective distraction to the teacher strike.
Well, as you know, lots of these things are in the works for years. This was actually on Jason Kenney's list of stuff to do.
Why?
So I'm not surprised. Well, I don't know. Maybe because it said Wild Rose Country. And I think there's some ties, even though it's our beautiful flower, ties to the Once Upon a Time legacy party. So I think that there's actually criticism of why to move away from what we currently have. I love it, shockingly. I voted last night and it was actually.
You've already bought your plate.
No, I didn't, because I have a Support Our Troops plate, unlike Mr. Carney. And so I won't buy a new one, but I did vote for the one that had the hay bales and mountains. I felt it was the most Alberta good mix. I don't like ones that look like we just are all Banff. So anyways, I voted for that one. I like it. It's also our coat of arms. So it's not like we just put a tagline from UCP, although that's obviously where the critics want to go. I don't know.
Obviously.
Yeah, it's like, whatever. I love strong and we are strong and free and I love it. But yes, I have a Support Our Troops plate. So I will not be getting one, but it's only $28.
You do have two vehicles though, right?
They both have Support Our Troops.
You have two, both vehicles have that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I will
So
say
we're
that
investing double than Carney is.
he just launched a massive
anyways,
defense strategy, but okay.
Well, he hasn't rolled it out. I'm going to be
Well, the
watching
budget is coming.
Yeah, but it better be in there. I'm going to be watching.
Yeah, it better be, or he would look really dumb.
How strong and free in supporting our troops is Mr. Carney? Anyways, but yeah, it's an interesting one. Are you going to vote? Also,
No.
Can I tell the funny story of why I voted? Because the UCP sent out an email about it, obviously, as they do. And it had a Ford truck. I drove a Chevy, so that's annoying. And then it had a, Hyundai Elantra or something on the image, like in the photo op with Nally and the Premier. And I was trying to zoom in to be like, what the vehicle? Like, that's not an Alberta vehicle. Anyways. So I clicked on it and it took me to the voting link. So then I voted.
And you voted.
But anyways, it was just funny because I was like trying to zoom in to like criticize the fact that their photo op had a Hyundai vehicle in it.
Well, I will just stay super true to brand here and say that at a time when we have the biggest teacher strike in Alberta's history, a healthcare crisis, economic uncertainty, a trade war, and a current pipeline battle, I think the license plate thing feels quite out of touch.
And what I'll say is go to alberta.ca to pick your favorite of the 6 license plate opportunities to keep us strong and free. God bless.
Wow. Well, that's another week.
That's how we're closing it.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week. But until then, make sure to follow us on X, Instagram, and TikTok.
And as always, please do us the big favor because our numbers are great, but we know that you don't all subscribe. So please like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.
The Discourse is hosted by Cheryl Oates and Erika Barudis. Follow on Instagram @TheDiscoursePod. Subscribe to The Discourse on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.